Well, good morning. Welcome. Very glad that you're here. If you're joining with us online, hey, in the back, it's good to see y'all. Awesome. Everybody, people are waving. This is great. It's a good morning. A little response, a little feedback. Sounds like it's buzzing a little bit. Maybe it needs to come down a little bit. I don't know. There we go. Well, hey, in your seat, and I mentioned this last week, we started a new series last week, and I mentioned this is going to be a note-taking series, and so I just recommend that. Now, you may be a note taker on your phone. I usually do that on my iPad, but just in case, we provided a blank piece of paper with some lines on it and pens in your seat, so I just recommend taking notes. Here's why. Because what we jumped into last week, it's just a little complicated. It's not one of those, it's not the easiest of things to talk about, but it is extremely essential because it is a foundational, it has been a fundamental, a foundational belief of Christians for the last 2,000 years. It's very important. And what we said last week is we were going to talk about the Trinity, or that we believe in a triune God, that we believe that God is only one God, but that he reveals himself in three persons. And as complicated as that is, here's why that's important for you to understand, because if you call yourself a Christian, that's what you believe. That's why we're talking about this. Whether it's confusing or not, or whether you fully understand it or not, which you won't, because nobody can, because we're finite, because we can't fully comprehend this, but it is the way that Scripture presents who God is, that he is one God in three persons. And so that's why we say this. It's what we believe here at Ridge Church. And so if you attend Ridge Church and you call yourself a Christian, you should know that. We would say, I believe in one living and true God who reveals himself to us in three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We talked about that last week. It's a concept that's very difficult to understand. So we're not saying, I fully understand this. We're just saying that this is what I believe. So the point of this series is really just to help us understand better who God really is, because it matters in how you relate to who God really is. And you can understand that if you don't fully understand, or at least are growing in your understanding of who God is, then it may affect how you relate to God. You can't misunderstand who God is and then not misunderstand how to relate to him. And so it's extremely important, because this is true. You can only be truly changed and transformed by knowing who God really is, or at least to the best of your knowledge, to the best of your ability, not by knowing who you think God is. And I know that we all understand how this works. I mean, this applies to really any aspect, any part of our life, that if you don't really fully understand something or a concept or a group of people, or if you're not, in relationship with something, then it means that you're going to probably, and this is why there's so much, difficulty in understanding motivations and what people are saying on the internet, because we don't fully know and understand somebody, and then which means that we then we misunderstand how to relate to them. And so we get that. I know that we understand that, but this is why there's a principle that kind of underlies this. That's what we've been talking about. That's kind of where we've been. But there's a principle that I want to address today. It's kind of a life principle, which means it applies to you and it applies to me, whether we realize it or not. That's what a principle is. It impacts you. It affects you, whether you like it or not. But this is what I want us to see today, and it's that how you relate to something is directly impacted by your proximity to it. Now, I mean, you know how this works. I mean, maybe when you were a kid, I used to do this. You remember, you could look up in the sky at night, and if it was a clear night and the moon was out, then you could literally just, hold your thumb up in the air, or maybe, a couple of fingers in the air, and you could cover up the moon. Do you remember being able to do that? And it's because of your proximity to the moon, which we understand, but no, I'd be willing to bet that nobody in here actually ever had the thought that your thumb was bigger than the moon. Did anybody? I mean, you can confess that, I guess. But I mean, most of us understand, I mean, you've never even been to the moon. You don't know what the moon actually looks like or how big it actually is because you haven't actually been to it. We've just seen it from a very far distance, and yet you know full well that your thumb isn't actually bigger than the moon, even though it can cover it up. And you know it's because of your perspective, because of the proximity between you and the moon, because of the distance there is. And that's true of anything, and not just physically. It's not just physical distance, but sometimes it's emotional distance. I mean, thinking about just sentimental objects in your house. Maybe there's a trophy or a letter that somebody wrote, or you're hanging on to that old baseball glove. And there's just something about it, and it has literally no value whatsoever to anybody in the world except for you. And some of you are better at hanging on to these items than others. Like, yeah, I mean, you can elbow each other. You know what that's like, though, and the item really has no value, but it's valuable to you. Why? Because there's stories connected to it, because there's memories connected to it, because of your proximity to, because of your close relationship to this item, it has value. And of course, it's not just with physical items or things that, are around us, but it's also in our relationships with other people. So how you relate to somebody is directly impacted by your proximity to them. And you know this is true. I mean, when you're in a relationship with somebody, how you feel about them and your intimacy with them or your distance to them, and again, not necessarily physically, but just kind of that emotional connection. You feel close to them. You've shared experiences together. You have similar interests, and you feel a certain way within that relationship. You either feel very close or you feel kind of distant. I mean, that just tends to happen. And sometimes you feel close to people who encourage you and speak life into you. You feel kind of distant when somebody has hurt you or says things that, kind of tear you down. And so that same thing applies. And so how you relate to that person is impacted by how you feel in proximity to them, whether you feel close to them or you feel far from them. Well, since that's true of our relationships with each other, it's also true of our relationship with God, which is why this matters. So how you relate to God is directly impacted by your proximity to Him, which is why we started talking about this last week, because you can have a relationship with God. See, that's what we believe as Christians, that this one God who reveals himself in three persons, one of the things that we believe about him is that he is a personal God, that he reveals himself and that he speaks to us and that we can commune with him. And that's very important because you can imagine that if you miss this, if you misunderstand who God really is, then you're going to misunderstand your role within the relationship. Am I right? I mean, think about this. This is probably true of some of you. I mean, you can imagine if you feel like God, like your concept of God is just this very distant, kind of otherworldly, out there, uninvolved, kind of like he doesn't care anything about your life. He's just kind of beyond all things, and he's very impersonal. Then you can imagine that would change how you relate to that God. But then for some of you, God is so small that you can actually fit him in your pocket like your own little magic genie. And you just kind of take him out whenever you need something or when things aren't really going your way. And so you can see whether God feels very close or whether God feels very distant, it impacts the way that you relate to him. And for some of you, this actually was the case for you. It maybe happened for you a long time ago, and it caused you to kind of walk away from faith and to abandon God in this whole journey. You just kind of walked away from it because you misinterpreted who God really is. Maybe you just didn't fully understand. Maybe there was a season in your life where, you kind of saw God as that, the big man upstairs. The guy in the sky, and that's the way you referred to him. And the only time you prayed to him was, and you praised him when you scored a touchdown and you cussed at him when your team lost, like it's that kind of God. You have that kind of relationship. But maybe let's just say you began to grow and you began to understand things a little bit better. And you began to learn that, hey, God is actually a lot closer than I actually thought he was. Like, matter of fact, you began to learn that maybe he's a little too close, and it began to bother you. Because he got so close that he was like too involved in your life. And it was like all of a sudden he was meddling, and he's kind of telling me that there's things that I should do, and there's things I shouldn't do, and there's things I should say and shouldn't say, and how I'm supposed to be and not be, and it bothered you a little bit, and so you just decided that, it felt more like God was just kind of always looking over your shoulder. And so for you, maybe you got to a place where you just kind of felt like this good God began to feel and seem more like just kind of an angry judge. For some of you, that's been your experience. And it just stopped there. Maybe because of your past, because of some things you've done, or because you felt like you weren't good enough, or, that maybe you just misconceived, misunderstood kind of the nature and the character of who God really is. And so you walked away. But here's the reason for this series, is because I feel like that's probably some of you here today. Maybe some of you watching or listening online. That has been some of your experience today. And so I want to talk about this because I want to give you a real reason to reconsider. Because it could be, just imagine with me, that maybe you walked away for the wrong reasons. Maybe you walked away from who you understood God to be rather than who God really is. Is that a possibility? Because who God really is, when we fully comprehend that, when we, to the best of our ability, I promise you wouldn't walk away. You wouldn't walk away from a God like that. Because the way that we talk about who God is more like this. Rather than an angry judge, rather than just the creator of the universe, even though God is our creator and God is our judge, but more than that, more important than that, and I promise you more than anything else, God is described this way, that he is a good and loving Father. That's the way Scripture portrays the character of Jesus. This is why when we talk about the Trinity, this is why when we recite something like the Apostles' Creed, what do we say? We say, I believe in God, what? The Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Notice what comes first. This is the designation. This is the name that we refer to God as first, because it is the most descriptive of who God really is and the character of God. God is like a good father. He is like a good father, not our kind of broken version of a not so good father, but like the absolute perfect or best version of what a good father would be like, which means he's very personal, he's very relational. The Aramaic word, you've probably heard this before. The Aramaic word for this is just Abba. Abba, Father. And this term, as a matter of fact, not only is kind of the concept, it's threaded through the Old Testament, not so much the specific language of Father, but when you get to the New Testament, oh my goodness, it's everywhere. Just in the Gospels alone, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this word shows up more than 160 times in reference to God. That's a lot of times. In fact, this was the word that Jesus chose to use most often. This was his favorite way to talk about his relationship with God. His relationship with God was the most like a father is with a son. God was like his father, and he was his son. And the term has very personal, very intimate, very relational context. It's dad or daddy or father, because this wasn't just something young children used. It wasn't just like, little children used the word Abba. This was young children, older children, even as adults. It was this kind of intimate term for father that was used to talk about their dad. But then Jesus used this word specifically to talk about his relationship with God, which is why this is so important, which is why this matters so much. And so I think that if we begin to see God this way, that you'll at least be willing to reconsider how you relate to your Heavenly Father. Not just to this judge out there somewhere, not to this creator of all things, the sustainer of all things, but God your Father, because that has huge implications for our lives and how we respond to who God is. And so when Jesus showed up on the earth, he came to reveal this to us. I mean, this was his favorite way to describe God and his relationship with him, and so he talked about it a lot. He taught this all the time. As a matter of fact, Jesus came to do this very thing, to communicate what God was really like, and this was the term that he used. He came to communicate. He taught this. He talked about it. He said God is very relational. He's very personal, and he's like a good father, and I'm like his son. And I want you to know him intimately and personally. It's why he taught things like what you're probably familiar with. He would tell stories like the story of the Prodigal Son, a parable, just a made-up story. But really, Jesus is trying to describe here for people what God is really like. And so in this story, God is represented by this father figure, and he and you and I are represented by the Son. And so you've probably heard this story before, but let me just give you kind of the synopsis version of this. So Jesus opens up and he tells this story, and he says there was a father, he had a couple of sons. The youngest son decided he wanted to be gone. He wanted to pack everything up and to leave, but he wanted to take his inheritance with him, even though his dad had not passed away. And so it was as if he said, Dad, I know you're still alive and kicking right now, and you probably got a few years, but I'm kind of ready to go. And so could we just pretend for a minute that like you're dead, and you just go ahead and cash out all of my savings and give it to me so that I can take it? And sure enough, what came to the audience's surprise was that Jesus said the father complied. He did it. I mean, it was like, really? Why would he do that? And yet the father complies. He gives him his inheritance early, even though I'm sure it hurt. And he left and he packed up everything. He went to another country. He squandered it. He wasted it on nothing. He had nothing to show for it. And so the audience, like you and me, is just thinking, oh my goodness, this is like worst case scenario kind of relationship between a father and a son. Matter of fact, it's unfixable. It can't get any worse than this. I mean, he not only, valued his stuff and his father's wealth more than he did his father's life. He then went and he wasted it all and on nothing, and he has nothing to show for it. And yet the son ends up wasting it all, and he gets to a place of desperation, and he goes and he gets a job working for a farmer, and he's feeding pigs. I mean, we're talking about the low of the low. And for a first century Jew to hear that this, Jesus was saying that the son was working, on a pig farm, not good. Not good. And so, I mean, this was like literally the lowest of the low. It doesn't get any worse. That's what Jesus is laying out here. Complete and utter rebellion, walking in a different direction. He got so hungry that what the pigs were eating sounded really good and appetizing. And so he finally decides, you know what, this is ridiculous. I think I'm going to try to go back home, and I'm going to just ask for forgiveness. And I have zero, this is the son, I have zero expectation that my father is going to allow me to be a son again. I don't deserve that. Like, I have forfeited that right. I can't be his son. But maybe, just maybe, if I convince him and give him a good story, maybe he'll at least hire me back on as a lowly servant. And so he goes back home. And then Jesus describes the picture of what this scene looked like. While the son was still a long way off, his father saw him. Why? Because he was watching for him. He was looking. And he was filled with compassion for his son. And he even ran to his son. He threw his arms around him and he kissed him. I mean, you talk about shock. I can only imagine what his audience would have been thinking as Jesus is telling this story. It's like, are you serious? I mean, this made zero sense to them. This was not a cultural norm by any stretch of the imagination. It made no sense. They had never seen anything remotely like this modeled for them, and it just didn't add up. After all that the son had done, why would this father react this way? Why would he respond this way? And yet he did. And in fact, he says that he was filled with compassion. Compassion? Let me try to put this in our own context for just a second. Consider this. Just imagine that on your absolute worst, most sinful, disgusting, everything is off, just darkest, ugliest, nastiest day in your life, where you are so walking in the other direction and not thinking about anything but yourself, and it's just gross. Just imagine for a second that when your heavenly Father looks at you, he is filled with compassion. Can you imagine that? And if the answer is no way, then maybe there's something we still don't understand about who God really is and the love he has for us. Because it's the way that Jesus just described the Father. And he even took it a step further. He said not only did he have compassion on him, but he received him like he was still his son. And without saying a word, without letting him tell his story, without asking any questions, without doing a thing or lifting a finger, he put his best clothes onto his son, and he put a ring back on his finger, which in that culture would have signified sonship once again. In other words, that ring would have said, everything that once was yours as my son is yours again, as if nothing had ever happened. And then he threw him a party. What? Like that, does that add up for anybody? Is that, have you ever known any father or any parent for that matter respond that extravagantly when there was that kind of rebellion and that kind of just broken relationship? I want nothing to do with you. And yet, this is the way that Jesus describes the nature of our Heavenly Father. I'm not making this up. This isn't something we just kind of tell. This is what Jesus was communicating. He came to communicate this. And it's overwhelming. Essentially, he was saying that God's love for you is like a good father who loves you, not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. When your Heavenly Father looks at you, he doesn't see your sin. He sees you. He sees you. And he's filled with compassion. He doesn't see your past. He knows it, but that's not how he sees you. He doesn't view you through the filter of your sin. He views you through the filter of his creation. He just knows who you are and who you were intended to be, and he loves you. He's filled with compassion, and he just sees a son and he sees a daughter. And that's what Jesus came to communicate. But Jesus didn't just come to communicate it. He came to demonstrate what God was also like. Not just to talk about it, he came to demonstrate it. He wanted to show it. In fact, in the Gospel of John, John in chapter 1 describes what this was like. He is talking about what is referred to as the incarnation, which just means that God is in flesh. That's all that means. And so he's describing this, and he said, look at what John says. Jesus was in the world. In other words, he's reflecting back, and he's saying when Jesus came into the world, because he did, and Jesus was God, and though the world was made through him because he was God, and he was part of creating the world, even though he created the world didn't recognize him. He's describing this relation. They misunderstood who God really was. Jesus came to that which was his own. I created these beings and I have come to them, but his own did not receive him. They didn't recognize him and they didn't receive him. Yet, John says, to all who did receive him, to those who did believe in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will. In other words, it's not the kind of sonship or daughtership that we might think of. This is completely different. This is being born of God. And that's what Jesus came to demonstrate. In other words, he's saying, for those who receive who he is and choose to believe in who he is, you have been given the right, even though you don't deserve it, even though you haven't earned it, without doing one thing, you have been given the right to be a child of God. You have been given a pathway back to your Father, and that's what Jesus was demonstrating. And so then he actually walks through this, and John says, no one has ever seen God. In other words, we've not seen him. The Old Testament, we get glimpses of God and, some of those interactions, but we've never really seen him until Jesus showed up. Well, why is that? Well, because Jesus was God incarnate in the flesh. So no one's ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in a closest relationship with the Father. He's God, but he's also in a relationship with God. That's what he just said. He himself is God, but he's also in closest relationship with God, with the Father. And he is the Son. That's what this relationship looks like. And he has made him known. It's what Jesus came to do. Jesus came to make him known, to help you and me to see what God's really like, to see who he is like, and that God is like this good Father who came and feels compassion for us and a burden for us and desires a relationship with us, and he never stops watching for us and looking for you and me. And he feels compassion, and he doesn't see us through our sin. He just sees us as we were created to be. That's what Jesus demonstrated. But then look, do you notice something about this? I mean, we're talking about you and I he just said that you and I, through Jesus, when we receive Jesus and we believe in his name, that we have the right to become children of God. He just said that. But then he turns right around the very next verse and he says, now Jesus is the one and only Son. It's like, well, hold up. Then in chapter 3, John chapter 3, verse 16, you're probably familiar with that. John again says, God sent his one and only Son. So how is that? How is it that this one and only Son of God could also have maybe, siblings, you and me? I mean, is that possible? How do we get to become children of God? Well, Paul answers this for us. The Apostle Paul answered this for us in Romans. And here's what he says. He says, for those who have received Jesus Christ have in turn received his Spirit. That's what he says. When you receive Christ, you actually receive his Spirit. In other words, you have some of him in you. And the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. Well, that's interesting. So the nature of the sonship of Jesus to the Father is just different than our potential to be in a relationship with God. In other words, we're not, you've heard the word begotten, in Old English we'd say, for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. In other words, that Jesus is in his very nature God. We're not. And so we are not begotten. We're not begotten of God because we are created beings. Therefore, we can only be adopted into this family. And by him we cry, because of what Jesus has done, we have the opportunity to be adopted into sonship. And so we cry, Abba, Father, just like he does. We have the privilege and the right to be able to say, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. And in that moment, you can know. And because of that, watch this. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ. We have been attributed, everything that was attributed to Jesus as the Son has been given to us. And in a moment, like in a flash, like in the very moment that you say yes to Jesus, that you put your trust and your faith in him and his name, you receive the gift. You receive the gift of Jesus himself, who is the Son of God. When you receive that, you are immediately adopted into the family, and everything that was Jesus in that relationship with the Father is yours. My wife Rebecca and I went to China several years ago, and we adopted our daughter, Shoei. Many of you probably know this. And Shoei's not in here to stand up and do a cartwheel for you, or she probably would at this point. But you know what? There was a moment there where we signed some paperwork and we picked her up, and in that instant, everything that was ours was now hers. And with the stroke of a pen, Shoei became ours. And just like our other 5 children, everything that was our biological children's, everything that was attributed to them, to be able to call us mommy and daddy was now also Shoei's. She didn't have to earn it. She didn't have to work for it. She didn't have to try real hard. It had nothing to do with her past. It had everything to do with the moment of us saying, you are ours. And forever, from now on, you're ours. It's not a gradual process. We are dressing you in our best clothes and putting a ring on your finger, and you are now our daughter. Period. And so you and I, likewise, we share in the sonship. This is what Jesus demonstrated, that we share in the sonship of Jesus through the adoption he has made possible for us. We share in that. Which I hope you can see why that would be so important to understand this relationship, because it is what is afforded you. Not on your own accord, not because you've earned it, not because you've deserved it somehow. None of us. It doesn't matter what your past looks like. It doesn't matter what your ugliest, darkest, nastiest day looks like. You have an opportunity through what Jesus did to step into the same kind of personal, relational relationship with God the Father. And so this is what I want you to be able to walk out of here, not fully understanding, but knowing and believing about who God is. To say, I believe that God is a good and loving Father. You see, that changes everything. It just changes everything. When you understand that that's the nature and the character of God, when you understand that, it should change how you view God. Your potential to have proximity to the Father, to have access to the Father, to be able to communicate with the Father, to commune with the Father, to spend time with the Father. He is personal. That's what that tells us. By Jesus communicating and demonstrating that God is like a father and that we can be adopted into his family, it means that Jesus is saying, God is personal. He's personal. You can know him. You can know him. He is relational. You can talk to him. He is your friend. He's your God. He's your judge. He's your creator. But more than that, he's your dad. He's your dad. God is personal, which also leads to this, that you can be in a relationship with God. That's important to understand. Some of you maybe have talked about, Christianity as religion before. It's just something, that you have to kind of follow the rules and get things right and show up on Sundays and check boxes. And that's not it. And I would walk away from that. I don't want anything to do with that. But that's not what Jesus came to offer. He didn't create religion. He didn't. Religion is a man-made approach to God. What Jesus came to offer was a relationship with God. And you will be adopted. When you enter into that relationship, this is what it means. It means you'll be adopted as a child of God, as a son, as a daughter. That's what the potential is for you and for me. And even though you've walked away at some point in your life and you've abandoned him and you've turned the other way, and it's like, I've spoken so negatively, I've wanted nothing to do with that, but, if this is true, then I just don't have anything to offer. I guess he's not going to, he's not going to have me back. And yet the truth is, you have an opportunity to be adopted back into that family. That's why we talk about it as a family of God, because it is a relational connection. And then you become, in that moment, a co-heir with Jesus. Everything that was attributed to Jesus is now attributed to you. It's given to you. It becomes a part of who you are. Does that follow? That should make a difference for you. And there's some of you today that you need to hear this. You need to hear this. Because maybe you walked away a long time ago. You walked away, you abandoned it. It's like, I'm done. I'm not pursuing that any longer. And it's because you didn't understand your proximity to the Father. You didn't see God that way. He's just kind of he was this out there, uninvolved, uncaring being, and I don't understand him. And if he's real, which, there's got to be a God, but if there is a God, he's impersonal and he didn't want anything to do with me anyway, because I've walked away. When the truth is that what Jesus communicates to you and me is that he's like a father. And guess what? He has never stopped watching for you to come back home. You hearing that? He has never stopped watching for you to come back home. And when he sees you come back home, he's not waiting on your answer. He's not waiting on you to, describe all of the problems and all of the wrongs and ask for forgiveness and to say it the right way and to do the right thing and to make sure that, I've got a plan now and I'm going to, without lifting a finger, by just coming back to him and receiving what Jesus came to offer, he puts you in his best clothes and he puts a ring back on your finger, and he sees you as you are. He sees you as his son. He sees you as his daughter, period. And man, I want you to see that today. I want you to see that God is more than just your creator. He's more than just your judge. God is your Father, and he is a good, incredibly good Father. And you can know him. Would you bow your heads with me? If that's you, you probably know it's you. You know that you are, like, that described you pretty well. It's like, I've walked away. But my prayer for you is that you would realize that maybe you walked away from a misunderstanding of who God is. Because who God really is a father to you, and he wants to be in a relationship with you. He desires that. He longs for that. Would you return to him today? It doesn't fix you. It doesn't make life perfect. It just means that you are redeemed. It just means that you are bought back. Jesus already did it. He's not that the expectation isn't that, you're going to do everything perfect now. The expectation is simply that you would trust him like a son trusts his father. Would you receive that today? You can pray something like this right where you are. God, you are my Father. And like any good father, I see that you love me. I hadn't recognized that before. I know that I've misunderstood what you're really like. And I've misunderstood what you want for me. And so today, I am turning around and I'm coming back home. And so I want to receive what Jesus has offered. to be adopted into your family, to be called a son, to be called a daughter, to be a child of the living God. I believe that. I know I need that because I'm a mess. I'm a sinner. I'm broken, and I need Jesus, my Savior. I put my trust in you. Father, thank you for loving me.